Aurora woke before dawn, as she always did. The crystal caves hummed with a gentle energy that had become familiar to her over the past decade. She stretched her long elf arms and felt the cool air of the underground cavern brush against her skin. Outside, the twin moons of her colony world were still visible in the pre-dawn darkness. She could hear the soft breathing of her dragons sleeping in their designated sections of the cave. She had named this place the Sanctuary, and it had become the heart of everything she believed in. The caves spread out across nearly 5 kilometers underground, with natural crystal formations that glowed with bioluminescent organisms. The crystals amplified sound and energy in ways that made the entire cavern feel alive and aware. Aurora had discovered that Storm and Ember responded to the vibrations of the crystals in ways that enhanced their natural abilities. Storm stirred first. The massive blue dragon lifted his head and looked at Aurora with eyes that seemed to contain lightning. He was larger now than when she had first found him as a hatchling 7 years ago. His wingspan stretched nearly 20 meters, and his scales had grown so thick that most conventional weapons could not pierce them. But size was not what made Storm special. It was his intelligence and his willingness to trust Aurora completely. Ember followed moments later. The smaller red dragon approached Aurora with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with her appearance. Her scales glowed like molten lava in the pre-dawn darkness. She nuzzled against Aurora's side, a gesture that showed the deep bond they had formed over the years. Aurora walked to the main cavern chamber where she kept her supplies and equipment. Humans had left much behind when they first colonized this world 3 centuries ago. Most of their technology was primitive compared to what existed in the galaxy. But there was wisdom in that simplicity. Human designs were elegant and practical. They did not rely on complex magical systems or ancient alien technology. They relied on understanding the fundamentals of physics and applying them in creative ways. She spent the morning reviewing combat tactics on an old human database. The files contained records of historical battles from Earth itself, conflicts that happened thousands of years before humanity even achieved space travel. The strategies were timeless. A smaller force with superior positioning could defeat a much larger army. A unified team could accomplish what individuals alone could not. Preparation and adaptation were more valuable than raw power. Around midday, Aurora led Storm and Ember out to the training grounds. This was an open area several kilometers from the colony itself, hidden behind a series of rocky outcrops that prevented easy observation from the skies. She had spent months preparing this location. There were structures built from reclaimed human military equipment that served as moving targets. There were obstacles that mimicked natural and artificial terrain. There were towers that shot projectiles at high speed. The training began as it always did. Aurora rode Storm while Ember flew alongside them. The dragon accelerated to full speed, and Aurora guided him through a series of complex maneuvers. Left, right, up, down, spinning, rolling. Each movement was precise and calculated. Storm had learned to anticipate her commands through subtle shifts in her body weight. They had achieved a level of synchronization that felt almost magical, though it was based entirely on practice and communication. Ember moved independently, performing her own combat exercises. She dove toward the ground at tremendous speed, and then pulled up at the last moment, missing the towers by meters. She practiced her fire breath on moving targets, calculating distance and wind resistance to place her flames with surgical precision. A dragon attacking blindly was just a dragon. A dragon that thought tactically was a weapon of devastating power. After 2 hours of intensive training, Aurora brought both dragons to rest. She dismounted from Storm and sat between the two creatures, leaning against Storm's warm chest. The dragons breathed heavily, but their eyes were alert and focused. She could feel their muscles trembling with the exertion of the training, but there was no pain or suffering in their expressions. They enjoyed this. They understood that they were becoming stronger and more capable with each passing day. Aurora pulled out a portable communication device from her gear. It was an old human radio, modified and upgraded over the years. She activated it and heard the voice of her friend Marcus, one of the few humans in the colony who knew about her dragons and her training program. Marcus said that the colony administrator wanted to meet with Aurora. This was unusual. Aurora had mostly kept to herself, working as a maintenance technician for the colony's power systems.
She had no official military rank or position.
She had always operated in the shadows, preparing in silence. Aurora knew that something had changed. Word must have spread about the mysterious elf woman training combat creatures in the hidden canyons. People were starting to ask questions. She made the decision to return to the colony and see what was happening. The colony itself was a collection of dome structures built into the side of a massive cliff face. The domes were connected by reinforced tunnels, creating a network that could be sealed off if needed. The entire settlement held only about 3,000 people, making it one of the smaller human colonies in this part of the galaxy. But it was her home, and the people who lived here had accepted her as one of their own despite her being an elf. She found the colony administrator in his office. His name was David, a man in his 60s with gray hair and kind eyes. He had been leading the colony for nearly 15 years. He stood up when Aurora entered, a gesture of respect that surprised her. David said that there had been strange readings on the colony's long-range sensors. Multiple ships were approaching from different directions, moving in coordinated patterns. This was unusual because most space traffic in this region followed predictable trade routes. These ships seemed to be deliberately converging on the colony's location. Aurora felt her heart rate increase. She asked what class of ships they were. David pulled up the sensor data on his screen. The ships were military in design, heavily armored with weapon systems that the colony's old sensors could barely categorize. They were big, powerful, and they were heading directly toward the colony at significant speed. Aurora asked how long they had before the ships arrived. David checked the calculations and told her that at their current velocity, they would reach the colony in approximately 36 hours. In 36 hours, the colony would either be destroyed or conquered. The old defense systems that humanity had left behind would not be adequate against modern military vessels. Aurora made a decision in that moment. She had been preparing for this her entire life, though she had not consciously known it. She told David that she could help defend the colony, but she would need cooperation. She would need him to trust her completely and to follow her instructions without question. David looked at her for a long moment. He must have heard the rumors about the elf woman and her mysterious creatures. He must have understood that she was offering something that the colony desperately needed. He said that he was willing to listen to any plan that might save their people. Aurora told him about the dragons. She explained that Storm and Ember were not normal creatures. They were intelligent, powerful, and trained to work as a coordinated military unit. She told him that she could use them to defend the colony, but she would also need the support of the human colonists. She needed them to be ready to fight, to adapt, and to think like soldiers rather than civilians. David took a deep breath. He said that he would rally the people. He said that they would prepare for battle. He said that the colony had survived for 300 years, and they would not fall without a fight. He offered Aurora the position of military commander, a title that had been empty for the past 50 years since the last conflict. Aurora accepted. As she left David's office, Aurora felt the weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders. Everything she had prepared for was about to happen. Everything she had learned, everything she had trained for, everything that Storm and Ember had learned through years of patient practice was about to be tested against real enemies in real battle. She made her way back to the underground sanctuary. The dragons sensed her approach and came to greet her. She could feel their excitement and their awareness that something significant was about to occur. She placed her hands on Storm's face and looked into his eyes. She told him that tomorrow they would finally discover if all their preparation had been enough. The two dragons pressed their heads against her, and Aurora felt their strength flowing into her. Outside, the stars continued their eternal march across the sky. Inside the sanctuary, three unlikely friends prepared for war. The galaxy had sent its warriors to conquer the small human colony, never believing that they would face opposition that could match their advanced technology and ancient experience. But the galaxy did not yet understand that it was about to encounter something far more dangerous than any conventional army. It was about to encounter the combined power of human determination, elf wisdom, and dragons that had learned to think and fight like soldiers trained in the art of war. The first hours of preparation were chaotic. Aurora moved through the colony with a sense of purpose that seemed to calm the panic spreading among the people. She organized the colonists into groups, assigning them to different tasks. Some would work on reinforcing the dome structures. Others would prepare the emergency shelters in the underground levels. Those with any military training or experience were separated and given basic weapons from the old armory. Marcus became her second in command, a role that he seemed to accept naturally. He was a former soldier from Earth, now in his late 40s, and he understood the language of warfare instinctively. Together they created a defensive strategy that took advantage of the colony's natural position on the cliff face. The domes could not be easily accessed from above or from the sides. The only vulnerable points were the main entrance and the landing platforms on the lower levels. Aurora worked with the engineers to set up ambush positions. She had them reinforce certain corridors with barriers and create defensive choke points, where larger numbers could be neutralized by smaller, better-positioned forces. She studied the old human military documents and implemented tactics that had been proven effective over centuries of human warfare. By the time evening fell on the first day, the colony had transformed from a civilian settlement into something that resembled a fortified position. However, Aurora knew that physical fortifications would not be enough. The incoming ships had weapons that could level entire structures from orbit. The colony would need an active defense, something that could strike back at the enemy before they could land overwhelming force on the ground. That night, she took Storm and Ember to the highest point on the colony, a plateau that overlooked the valley below. She had brought with her several human communication devices, equipment that would allow her to coordinate with the dragons during combat. She spent hours teaching them about the incoming threat. She showed them images of the Zulthar ships on portable displays. She explained that these creatures were invaders and that they meant harm to the colony and to all the people who lived here. Storm seemed to understand instinctively. His eyes blazed with lightning as he studied the images. Ember, more gentle by nature, also showed signs of determination. Aurora knew that both dragons would fight because she had asked them to. But she also knew that they had their own sense of right and wrong, their own understanding that harm to innocence was something that required resistance. She spent the night with them, speaking softly about her dreams for the future. She told them that she wanted the colony to survive so that more humans and elves could live together in peace. She wanted to prove that different species could work together, could learn from each other, and could become stronger through that unity. The dragons listened, and Aurora felt their support flow back to her through the invisible bonds that connected them. By dawn of the second day, the colony was ready. Scouts positioned on the upper cliff faces reported that the enemy ships had entered the outer atmosphere. The colony's long-range sensors picked up multiple vessels deploying smaller attack craft. There were at least a dozen large capital ships, each of them larger than anything the humans had ever built. There were 40 to 50 fighter-class vessels accompanying them. This was not a raid or a reconnaissance mission. This was a full invasion force. Aurora stood in the main command center with David and Marcus. They watched the sensors as the enemy force moved into position. The lead ship opened a communication channel and broadcast a message across all frequencies. The voice that came through was harsh and grating, translated by the colony's computer into human language. The Zulthar commander announced that the human colony was now under the jurisdiction of the Zulthar Empire. All inhabitants were to surrender immediately. Resistance would result in the complete annihilation of the settlement. The commander offered the colonists 1 hour to comply. Aurora and David exchanged a look. There was no doubt about what would happen if they surrendered. The Zulthar were known throughout the galaxy for their brutal treatment of conquered populations. Surrender would mean slavery at best, death at worst. There was only one viable option. Aurora activated the communication system that connected her to Storm and Ember. She told the dragons that it was time. She could hear Storm's answering call, a sound like thunder mixed with the crack of a whip. The dragons took flight from their hidden positions and moved toward the upper atmosphere. The first surprise came as Storm reached the altitude of the incoming enemy fighters. The Zulthar had never encountered creatures like the dragons. Their targeting systems locked onto Storm and opened fire with particle beam weapons. But Aurora had trained Storm for exactly this scenario. The dragon twisted and turned with impossible agility, moving in ways that biological creatures could not be expected to move. He avoided 90% of the incoming fire. The 10% that connected hit his scales and created brilliant flashes of light, but they caused minimal damage. Storm's natural armor was more effective against advanced weapons than Aurora had anticipated. The electrical patterns on his scales seemed to absorb and dissipate the energy of the attacks, converting them into harmless light shows. Storm responded to the attack by unleashing his lightning breath directly at the nearest fighter formation. 3 Zolthar fighter craft exploded in brilliant flares of electromagnetic discharge. The pilots had no idea how to defend against this kind of attack. Their shields were designed to protect against conventional weapons and energy beams, not against biological lightning that moved at the speed of thought. Ember attacked from a different vector, diving from above and igniting her crimson flames. 2 more Zolthar fighters fell to her assault before they could even understand what was attacking them. Within minutes, the Zolthar had lost 10% of their fighter force to creatures they did not even know existed. The lead capital ship redirected its attention from the colony and opened fire on the dragons. This was the critical moment. The ship's weapons were far more powerful than the fighters. Its defensive capabilities were designed to handle multiple threats simultaneously. But the ship had one weakness. It was designed by creatures who thought in linear patterns. Its weapon systems were programmed to track and destroy targets using predictable algorithms. Aurora had spent years studying human military history and tactics. She knew that the most effective way to defeat a superior force was to be unpredictable. She guided Storm in patterns that no artificial defense system could anticipate. The dragon flew upside down. He moved in spirals and curves that defied physics. He made sharp 180-degree turns that would have crushed any other creature. The ship's weapons tracked him but could not hit him. Meanwhile, Ember used a different strategy. She flew low, using the natural terrain features of the colony's surrounding mountains as cover. When the ship tried to attack her, she used the landscape to her advantage, hiding behind peaks and ridges, then emerging to strike from unexpected angles. The ship's captain realized that his weapons were not effective against these creatures. The Zolthar made a critical error. They decided that the dragons were a distraction, a minor annoyance that they could eliminate by directing overwhelming force at the colony itself. The lead ship moved directly above the main dome complex and prepared to launch a devastating ground-clearing attack. But Aurora had anticipated this move. She had positioned herself on the upper cliff face with a piece of human military equipment that the colonists had salvaged years ago. It was an old railgun, a weapon that fired projectiles at hypervelocity using electromagnetic acceleration. It was not a weapon that required advanced technology to operate. It required only electricity, precision, and timing. As the Zolthar ship lowered its weapons toward the colony, Aurora fired the railgun directly at the ship's main reactor core. The projectile was made of dense material and was accelerated to speeds that made it nearly as destructive as a missile. It hit the ship's hull with devastating force, piercing through multiple layers of armor and shielding. An explosion erupted from the side of the capital ship, a bloom of fire and destruction that lit up the sky. The ship's defensive systems went offline. Its communication systems failed. For a moment, the entire Zolthar operation was in chaos. Storm seized the opportunity and flew directly at the damaged ship. He breathed lightning into the gap created by the railgun strike, and the electricity spread through the ship's systems like a virus, destroying circuit boards and power systems. The ship began to fall, losing altitude in a spiral descent that would take it away from the colony. The Zolthar command recovered from the initial shock of the attack. They realized that they were facing more than just dragons and primitive colonists. They were facing an enemy that thought differently, that acted unpredictably, that combined biological weapons with strategic thinking and ancient human technology. For the first time in their long history, the Zolthar Empire faced an opponent that they did not understand, and they were beginning to lose. The hours following the first battle were spent in frantic preparation. The wounded from the Zolthar attack were minimal among the colonists because the enemy had been so thoroughly disrupted. But the psychological impact of the victory was extraordinary. People who had been terrified moments ago now walked with new hope in their eyes. They had seen their defenders, these magnificent creatures of scales and fire and lightning. They had witnessed the impossible, and it had given them courage. Aurora worked with the engineering teams to repair the damage caused by the Zolthar's few successful attacks. The hull of one dome had been breached, but the colonists had sealed it before significant decompression could occur. The damage was repairable, though it would take time and resources. More importantly, Aurora used the time to analyze the enemy tactics. She studied the combat recording from the first battle, watching how the Zolthar weapons moved, how their targeting systems worked, how their strategy evolved during the engagement. She sent this information to Marcus and the other human soldiers, explaining what they had learned about their enemy. Marcus pointed out something that Aurora might have missed. The Zulthar had a pattern to their attacks. They relied on overwhelming force and superior firepower to destroy opposition before it could mount an effective defense. They did not expect to face an enemy that could dodge their fire or that could attack from unconventional vectors. The Zulthar way of war was direct and straightforward. They attacked with everything they had until resistance ceased. This observation was crucial. It meant that the Zulthar were not as tactically flexible as Aurora had initially feared. They could adapt to new situations, but adaptation took time. If Aurora could keep them off balance, keep them responding to unexpected threats, she might be able to stretch this conflict over a longer time frame. A prolonged conflict could work in the colony's favor because the Zulthar were operating at the end of a long supply line, far from their home worlds. David called a meeting with the colony council. These were the various administrators and leaders who managed different aspects of the colony's operations. Aurora attended the meeting, and for the first time she spoke openly about her dragons and her years of preparation. She explained that the colony now had a military asset that was unique in this region of space. She explained that she had trained the dragons using human tactical principles combined with natural dragon abilities. One council member, a woman named Catherine who managed the colony's agriculture, asked about the sustainability of the defense strategy. She wanted to know if the dragons could be maintained long-term. Aurora responded honestly that the dragons needed to eat. They required several thousand calories per day to maintain their strength. But the colony had stored food supplies and access to wildlife in the surrounding forests. There were creatures suitable for dragon diet if one knew where to find them. Aurora had already identified several species that she could use for this purpose. Another council member, a man named Henry, raised concerns about the risk of keeping such powerful creatures in or near the colony. He asked if the dragons could be controlled. Would they not eventually break free and become a threat to the colonists themselves? This was a valid concern, and Aurora had no easy answer for it. She told Henry that the only guarantee she could offer was her personal commitment to maintaining control. She had bonded with these dragons from their birth. She had raised them. They trusted her completely, and she had never given them reason to doubt that trust. What Aurora did not say was that the dragons could potentially turn on the colony if they ever lost confidence in her leadership or if they were captured and tortured by the enemy. It was a risk, but it was a risk worth taking compared to the certainty of annihilation if they were left defenseless. David supported Aurora's position completely. He declared that the colony would treat the dragons as honored members of their defensive force. He offered resources to expand the sanctuary underground, providing better facilities for Storm and Ember. He assigned several workers to help Aurora with the care and feeding of the creatures. The next day, the long-range sensors detected new movement in the surrounding space. The Zulthar forces were returning, but this time they were approaching more cautiously. The main fleet was moving to a position further from the colony, and smaller scout ships were being sent to probe the colony's defenses. Aurora had anticipated this move. The Zulthar commander was regrouping, reassessing, and preparing a new strategy based on what he had learned from the first engagement. Aurora discussed with Marcus the most likely Zulthar approach. They had seen that dragons were effective against the Zulthar fighter craft and against individual capital ships. The next logical step would be to send ground forces to assault the colony directly, using superior numbers and heavy armor to overwhelm the defenders. The Zulthar would want to complete this quickly before the dragons could mount an effective aerial defense. Aurora began training the human colonists in earnest. She worked with those who had military experience to teach the others how to organize themselves into effective combat units. She taught them about flanking movements and defensive positions. She taught them about using terrain advantages and working as a coordinated force, rather than as individuals. Marcus set up several training camps in the areas surrounding the colony. He drilled the defenders repeatedly in tactical movements and response patterns. He taught them how to use the weapons from the old armory, antiquated by galactic standards but still effective when used correctly. The colonists, most of whom had never expected to become soldiers, began to organize themselves into something that resembled a real military force. Aurora spent time with Storm and Ember preparing them for ground combat operations. She taught them how to provide air support for troops. She taught them how to strafe enemy positions without risking harm to friendly forces. She taught them how to identify and eliminate priority targets like enemy commanders and heavy weapons emplacements. On the evening of the second day after the first battle, the Zolthar made their move. Multiple landing craft descended from the orbiting ships heading directly for the colony. These were not delicate ships designed for cargo or passengers. These were military transports heavily armored and equipped with weapons. Each one could carry a full combat platoon of Zolthar soldiers. Aurora stood with David in the command center, watching the sensors as the transport ships approached. She counted at least 30 landing craft. Each one would likely carry 50 to 100 combat troops. The Zolthar were committing a force of 3,000 to 4,000 soldiers to this ground assault. They believed that overwhelming numbers and heavily armed troops could crush any resistance that the colony could mount. What they did not understand was that the colony's defenders were no longer just frightened colonists. They had been transformed in the past 2 days into something more. They had been given training, purpose, and the knowledge that they stood a realistic chance of survival. They had been given leaders who knew how to organize them. They had been given courage by witnessing the power of their dragon defenders. But most importantly, they had been reminded of what humans had always been capable of. When faced with impossible odds, humans did not surrender. They adapted. They fought. They found ways to survive and to overcome. This was the greatest gift that Aurora had given to the colony. It was not just the dragons. It was the reminder of their own nature as humans, a species that had survived countless wars and challenges across their history. Aurora activated the communication system and spoke to Storm and Ember. She told them that the final battle was beginning. She told them that today would determine the fate of everyone in the colony. She told them that they had trained for this moment. And now they would prove that their preparation was not in vain. The 2 dragons answered with their battle cries, sounds that echoed across the valley and struck fear into the hearts of the approaching Zolthar troops. The landing craft accelerated their descent, eager to reach the ground and begin the assault. They did not yet realize that they were flying directly into a carefully planned trap, that every aspect of their approach had been anticipated and prepared for, and that the defenders below were not the frightened civilians they expected to find. The final confrontation between the Zolthar Empire and the colony was about to begin. The landing craft descended in waves, with the first group attempting to establish a beachhead near the colony's main entrance. Aurora watched from her command position high on the cliff as the transport ships began their final approach. The moment they slowed enough to deploy troops, Storm and Ember struck. The blue dragon came from above, his lightning breath devastating the first transport craft. The electrical energy spread through the ship's metal hull, causing systems to fail and weapons to go offline. The transport crashed hard, landing on its side but not completely destroyed. Dozens of Zolthar soldiers emerged from the damaged craft, their armor smoking and their weapons ready. Before these troops could organize themselves, human defenders opened fire from carefully prepared positions along the cliff face. The colonists had set up defensive lines in the rocky terrain, places where they could take cover and fire down on the invaders with superior positioning. The first wave of Zolthar troops took heavy casualties immediately. Ember attacked the second wave of landing craft, using her fire breath to superheat sections of the armor plating. Metal warped and deformed under the intense heat. The second transport crashed even more heavily than the first, its structural integrity compromised by the dragon's attack. Again, troops emerged to find themselves under fire from coordinated human defenders. Marcus led a team of human soldiers in a flanking maneuver. They moved through the predetermined passages in the rocky terrain, emerging behind a group of Zolthar soldiers who had managed to establish a firing line. The humans opened fire with precision, taking down targets who never saw the attack coming. The Zolthar soldiers were strong and their armor was advanced, but they were not soldiers who had learned to expect ambush and counterattack. Their training emphasized overwhelming force, not defensive flexibility. The battle quickly became a nightmare for the Zolthar commander. His carefully planned assault was disintegrating in ways that he had not anticipated. The defenders were not concentrated in a single location. They were everywhere, attacking from multiple angles, using the terrain to their advantage. Worst of all, the creatures that had attacked his fleet in the first battle were now active in the ground assault, striking at the landing craft and eliminating groups of troops before they could even form proper combat formations. Aurora coordinated the defense from the command center, speaking to Marcus through communication devices and directing Storm and Ember to intercept the most dangerous threats. When a group of Zolthar soldiers managed to break through the initial defensive line and began advancing toward the colony dome, Aurora directed Ember to intercept them. The red dragon dove from the sky, attacking with precision and fury, driving the Zolthar soldiers back toward the human defenders who caught them in crossfire. A new threat emerged when the Zolthar deployed a heavy weapons squad. These soldiers carried large armor-piercing weapons that were designed to penetrate the thick hides of large creatures. They opened fire on Storm as the blue dragon descended for another attack run. Several rounds struck home, and though the dragon's scales protected him from fatal damage, the impact was enough to knock him off balance and force him to climb back to altitude. Aurora made a critical decision. She left the command center and moved to the upper cliff face with a portable weapon system. It was another piece of old human technology, a guided missile launcher that had been in storage for decades. The colonists had managed to restore it to operational status, though ammunition was limited. There were only enough missiles for 3 or 4 shots before the launcher would need to be reloaded. She waited for the right moment. The heavy weapons squad was concentrating on attacking Storm, keeping him occupied while other Zolthar troops attempted to push through the defensive positions. Aurora locked her targeting system onto the weapons squad. She fired a single missile. The warhead struck the center of the Zolthar formation, and the explosion was catastrophic. The heavy weapons squad was eliminated in seconds. With the immediate anti-dragon threat removed, Storm was able to resume his aggressive attacks. He dove on the remaining Zolthar troops, scattering them with carefully placed lightning breath attacks that did minimal damage to the surrounding terrain but caused massive casualties among the exposed soldiers. The Zolthar commander realized that he was losing the battle. His carefully planned invasion was crumbling. His troops were sustaining casualties at a rate far higher than anticipated. His ships could not provide effective support because the dragons controlled the airspace above the colony. Most importantly, the defenders below were proving to be far more organized and tactically proficient than he had expected from a group of colonists. He made the decision to escalate the conflict. He ordered additional landing craft to descend, this time deploying heavier armored units and additional weapons. He believed that if he could commit enough forces quickly enough, he could overwhelm the defenders through sheer attrition. It was a strategy that had worked countless times before across his empire. It had never failed him, but Aurora had prepared for exactly this scenario. She had stored additional ammunition and resources throughout the colony. She had trained the defenders in response patterns for handling waves of repeated assaults. She had positioned the dragons not just for offense, but for maximum effect at critical moments. As the second wave of landing craft descended, the colony's defenders adopted a new formation. They concentrated their forces on multiple defensive positions rather than spreading thin across a large area. They focused on eliminating enemies methodically rather than trying to hold every position simultaneously. This allowed them to inflict maximum casualties while maintaining their own strength and reserves. Ember and Storm adopted a new strategy as well. Instead of attacking individual troops or landing craft, they focused on the command and control centers of the Zolthar forces. They identified the heavily armored transports that carried the senior officers and focused their attacks on these vehicles. This had the effect of creating confusion and disorganization among the Zolthar troops. Without clear command structure, the invaders struggled to coordinate their movements and attacks. After 4 hours of intense fighting, the Zolthar commander realized the bitter truth. He was going to lose this battle. His forces were being decimated. The colony was not surrendering. The creatures defending it seemed to have unlimited energy and strategic capability. The reinforcements he had expected to break through, the enemy lines were not materializing because they were being intercepted by the dragons before they could reach effective positions. Aurora observed the moment when the Zolthar commander made his decision to withdraw. His troops began to fall back toward the remaining landing craft. The retreat became increasingly desperate as the human defenders pressed forward, eliminating isolated groups of soldiers and destroying abandoned equipment. Marcus and his team pursued the retreating Zolthar, driving them back with continuous fire. The dragons participated in the pursuit, attacking from above and herding the enemy soldiers toward the landing craft, like predators driving prey. The final flights of landing craft lifted off hastily, many of them damaged, and not all of them successfully achieving stable orbit. Aurora stood on the cliff face and watched as the Zolthar fleet began to withdraw from the colony's location. The remaining capital ships accelerated away, moving to a distance that would place them out of reach of the dragons and the colony's defensive weapons. The invasion force that had seemed so overwhelming just hours ago was now in full retreat, leaving behind wreckage and the bodies of their fallen soldiers. The colony had won. They had faced the full might of the Zolthar invasion force and had defeated them. The colonists emerged from their positions exhausted but exhilarated. The threat had been repelled. Against impossible odds, they had survived. Aurora descended from the cliff and moved through the colony's main dome. People were cheering, embracing each other, celebrating the victory. But Aurora knew that the victory was incomplete. The Zolthar had not been destroyed. They had only been forced to retreat. The fleet was withdrawing, but it was still out there, still a threat, still capable of returning with reinforcements. She made her way to the sanctuary where Storm and Ember rested. Both dragons were wounded from the intense battle. They had scratches and burns across their scales, evidence of the weapons that the Zolthar had deployed against them. But their eyes were still bright with the fire of victory. They had proven themselves in real combat, and they had performed exactly as Aurora had trained them to perform. Aurora pressed her forehead against Storm's great head and felt the warmth of his breath. She whispered words of gratitude and praise for the dragons and for the colonists who had stood and fought so bravely. The first invasion had been repelled, but everyone in the colony understood that this was not the end of the conflict. It was only the beginning of a much longer war. The days following the successful defense of the colony were filled with a mixture of celebration and hard work. The wounded colonists were treated in the medical facilities, and fortunately, casualties had been lighter than expected. The coordinated defense had saved many lives. But there were still dead to mourn and injuries to heal. The colony held a memorial service for those who had fallen during the invasion, both humans and the few elves who had joined in the final defense. Aurora stood at the memorial, her silver eyes reflecting the light of the ceremonial flames. She thought about the price of victory and about the responsibility that had been thrust upon her. She had never wanted to be a military commander or a hero. She had simply wanted to prepare herself and her dragons for a threat that she had always known would eventually arrive. David approached her after the memorial service concluded. He told her that there was an incoming message from the Zolthar Command Center. The transmission had been intercepted by the colony's long-range communication system. The Zolthar commander who had overseen the invasion was transmitting a report to his superiors, and remarkably, he was not making excuses. He was explaining with brutal honesty what had happened at the colony and why his invasion force had failed. Aurora asked to hear the message. David activated the recording device. The commander's voice came through, harsh and grating, but filled with something that sounded almost like respect. He explained that the colony defended by human colonists and two creatures of extraordinary capability had proven to be a far more formidable opponent than anticipated. He recommended that the Zolthar Empire reconsider its approach to this region of space. But more importantly, he warned his superiors about something that extended beyond this single colony. He said that humans, when cornered and given leadership worth following, had proven themselves to be dangerous and unpredictable combatants. He warned that underestimating human colonies in the future might prove to be a grave strategic error. The recording ended, and Aurora felt the weight of that transmission settle on her shoulders. The message was not just a battle report. It was a warning about the entire human species. The ancient alien empires that had dismissed humanity as insignificant were beginning to see what humans were truly capable of. Over the following weeks, something remarkable began to happen. Other human colonies started sending messages to Aurora and to David. They wanted to know about the defense strategy that had defeated the Zolthar invasion. They wanted to know about the dragons. They wanted to know if they could implement similar defensive protocols. Word was spreading throughout the human colonies faster than any conventional communication could travel. Aurora realized that she had to make a choice. She could keep her knowledge of dragons and combat tactics locked away in this single colony, maintaining it as a local advantage, or she could share this information with the wider human community. potentially elevating the defensive capabilities of all human colonies across the galaxy. She met with David, Marcus, and the Council to discuss this decision. Marcus pointed out that if other human colonies could develop similar defenses, it would create a network of resistance that would be far more difficult for the Zolthar to overcome. Even if the Zolthar succeeded in conquering some colonies, they would face increasing losses and increasing challenges. Catherine, who managed agriculture, suggested that the colony could establish a breeding program for dragon hatchlings. If they could reproduce the success they had achieved with Storm and Ember, they could potentially provide other colonies with dragons trained in the same tactical methods. It was an ambitious plan, but it was not impossible. Henry, who had expressed concerns about the dragons earlier, admitted that his doubts had been proven wrong. He proposed that the colony establish a military academy, where humans and other species could learn the tactics and strategies that had proven so effective in the defense. The colony could become a training center for the wider human defensive network. Aurora supported all of these proposals. She spent weeks preparing comprehensive documentation of her training methods. She created detailed records of the tactical principles that had worked so effectively. She documented everything she had learned about dragon psychology, capabilities, and optimal combat utilization. She also spent time with Storm and Ember preparing them for the possibility that they might eventually need to travel to other colonies and help establish new training centers. The dragons seemed to understand the importance of this mission. They were willing to participate in whatever Aurora asked of them. 3 months after the successful defense of the colony, the first group of new trainees arrived. They came from 3 different nearby human colonies, young people with potential who had been identified as suitable for military training. Aurora and Marcus began working with them intensively, teaching them the principles of coordinated defense and small unit tactics. But something more profound was happening as well. The news of the colony's victory continued to spread throughout the galaxy. Initially, the ancient alien powers had dismissed the reports as exaggeration or propaganda. But as evidence accumulated, as more human colonies reported successfully repelling invaders using similar tactics, the attitude began to shift. An independent merchant named Kevin arrived at the colony 6 months after the invasion. He was from one of the older human families that had been established in the outer colonies for generations. He brought news from the central human worlds and from the wider galactic community. He told Aurora that the Zolthar Empire was beginning to experience resistance throughout its territories. In multiple locations, coordinated human defenders were inflicting significant losses on Zolthar occupation forces. More remarkably, Kevin reported that other species were beginning to notice the change in human capabilities. The Karath Syndicate, a trade organization that had previously looked down on humanity, was now interested in negotiating equal partnership agreements. The Sentient Council, a body that represented multiple advanced civilizations, was discussing whether to grant humanity permanent representation for the first time. The galaxy was beginning to see humans differently, not as a primitive species to be conquered or exploited, but as a genuine military and political power that had to be considered in any equation of galactic politics. Aurora felt the responsibility of this shift. She understood that the victory at the colony had created a cascade effect, changing the perception of humanity across the entire known galaxy, but she also understood that perception had to be backed by capability and strength. If humanity was to claim its place among the advanced civilizations of the galaxy, it had to continue to demonstrate competence, strategic thinking, and the kind of unwavering determination that had been demonstrated at the colony. She worked even more intensively with the dragon breeding program. Storm and Ember had produced 2 hatchlings in the months following the invasion. These young dragons showed the same intelligence and adaptability as their parents. Aurora began training them as early as their development would allow, confident that they would eventually surpass even their parents in capability. One evening, Aurora stood with David and Marcus on the highest point of the colony, looking out over the valley toward the stars. She asked them what they thought would happen next. Would the galaxy continue to change, or would the ancient powers attempt to suppress the growing human influence? Marcus said that humans had always been fighters. Throughout history, whenever humans had been given the opportunity to stand against oppression and injustice, they had done so. He believed that this time would be no different. The galaxy had underestimated humanity for too long. Now it was humanity's turn to show what was possible. David added that the colony had proven that cooperation between different species could work. Humans, elves, and dragons had worked together to create something that none of them could have achieved alone. He believed that this model could be replicated across the galaxy, that other species might learn to work together instead of constantly fighting for dominance. Aurora said very little. She was thinking about the future, about the long road ahead, about all the challenges that would come as humanity began to claim its rightful place among the galactic powers. She was thinking about Storm and Ember, about their descendants, about the dragons that would eventually fly across the skies of countless worlds. She was thinking about the young trainees in the academy below, learning tactics and strategy, preparing themselves to defend their people and their homes. The galaxy had laughed at Earth for so long. It had looked at humans as primitive and insignificant. It had believed that a species so young, so new to space travel, could never pose a real threat to the established powers. But the galaxy had been wrong. Humanity had survived in a hostile universe by adapting, by learning, by constantly pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Now, with Storm and Ember at their side, with dragons and tactics and determination, humanity was beginning to assert itself. The ancient order of the galaxy was changing. The age of human dominance was beginning, not through conquest and cruelty, but through cooperation, strategy, and the unbreakable spirit that had always defined the human species.